class. I hope you enjoyed this week's tale, the Prioress Tale. And it's really an interesting tale, fairly popular throughout a number of centuries. The reason maybe it was so popular is the figure of the Prioress herself was quite popular, and so was the tale. One of the things that you'll need to note about this tale is it's highly anti-Semitic. I think many of us like to focus on the Holocaust as evidence of prejudice against the Jews in the modern times. And, I mean, it was terrible. The Holocaust was, killing so many millions. But what we may not always think about is that prejudice had a very long history. If you've read any of Shakespeare's works, you can see some of this prejudice against the Jews displayed. And certainly this tale uses it. The tale itself is a miracle tale. It falls under a broader umbrella of hagiography, or kind of holy writings, writings about holy things, whether it's the lives of saints or miracle tales, or a number of other possible injunctions. If it had to do with the sacred at the time, then it often fell under that umbrella of hagiography, but specifically it is a miracle tale or a conte de veau. And miracle tales of the Virgin were especially popular when we consider the Prioress, who's a female clergy person. What we have to consider is the fact that at the time there weren't as many powerful female saints or divine figures. That has changed a little bit. We see more female saints now. But certainly at the time, one of the most popular saints, even though there was a general scarcity of female saints, one of the most popular saints was the Virgin. And so it is entirely appropriate for our Prioress to tell a miracle tale about the Virgin. And in fact, at the time they had what we refer to often as the cult of the Virgin. It had become the Virgin, and worship of her was so popular at the time, maybe because the idea of Father God or the Christ is so masculinely oriented that believers kind of longed for some kind of matriarchal presence in the divine, that Mary became very, very popular, and later was even canonized as the Queen of Heaven, not just as a saint, but as the Queen of Heaven. And the argument would go that she remained a virgin throughout, not only a virgin when she conceived of Christ, but even through his birth, which is not always a position maintained by every church, though the Roman Catholic Church does maintain that position. And that virginity is, of course, especially important for her. But to return again to the Prioress, we had discussed the fact that she, kind of in the general prologue, she's sort of a Miss Manners. She acts like a lady in a romance, or longs to be more of a court lady than she does a proper nun. And one of the things that's noted about that is the fact that she seems to care more for animals than she does for people. And at the time, that's a direct criticism, actually. It's not supposed to say that she's got a tender heart. Instead, it's saying that her tender heart is misplaced, that she needs to have more of a heart for people, and instead she has it for animals, like a mouse caught in a trap, instead of a person who needs help, who's sick, or in other ways suffering. And so we have to consider this sort of figure as not an evil person, but not exactly a good nun. She definitely lacks in some of those areas, and she does tell a very popular tale. And I think I mentioned in the announcements that this tale was even reproduced. I believe it's in a 19th century book of manners, and they're talking about the prioress herself as being indicative of good manners, but then they also reproduce her tale, in some ways reproducing some of the prejudices that the tale gives evidence of. I think I also note that there's two ways to read this tale. Just as a simple, straightforward tale of devotion, in the sense that we see kind of the power of Mary and her influence and praise of her, contrasted with kind of this very dark stereotype of the Jews. And so that there are two ways to read it. When we read it with more modern eyes, we may be somewhat taken aback by the strong anti-Semitic vein in the story. But if we read it through medieval eyes, where anti-Semitism was entirely common, then it seems like a less dark tale. Certainly it's still dark, but it ends beautifully with the, if a little bit macabrely, with the child singing out of his sliced throat. And this tale was fairly popular. There's a number of different renditions of it, of a child that loves the Virgin and likes to sing to her, and who later, after having been killed in some violent sort of way, usually by having a sliced throat, then later kind of is given power to sing again by the power of the Virgin. And what's interesting about this, I think, is it tells us something about a voice. We've talked about characters that the tellers may identify with, and I think it's quite possible that we could identify the prioress herself with the young boy. And the reason why is because women, much like children at the time, were often silenced. They didn't have much of a voice. And the fact that this young boy who's singing divine songs is permanently silenced by this evil force, which in the tale is the Jews, but might even more so kind of come to mean any sort of group that would silence the weak or the vulnerable, when the weak or the vulnerable are only seeking solace in religion. And that could be a number of different groups, again, reading it through medieval eyes. And in those cases that you see instead the gift of the voice given back to that weaker party, in this case the child. In this way, maybe the prioress herself, she may see that she has gained a voice not only in this tale-telling contest, but that maybe the Virgin has granted her a voice in medieval society. At the time, and there's a very popular article on this, women were considered to be one of two kind of archetype groups. You either fell under the umbrella of Eve and were sinful and lustful and were only there to lead men astray, or you fell under Mary. And Mary, of course, was virginal and good and perfect and beautiful and the Queen of Heaven. And women kind of most men would kind of categorize women in this way. Certainly it is not appropriate because women, there's a lot of variety in women. They don't fall under just one or the other groupings. But before the cult of Mary sprung up, there wasn't even that positive image of women around so much. So even though it is very limiting to have only the two archetypes that most women were considered under, nonetheless, the fact that the Mary archetype did enter the picture actually improved women's lot quite a bit, because at least there was a positive archetype, a possible positive archetype for them to be classified under, instead of only the negative archetype, which is more what they had before Mary became so popular as a saint figure. And I think the prioress, of course, most female clergy, most nuns, would have been particularly fond of Mary and of her worship for those reasons. That nuns would have been expected to kind of live by that same sort of set of behaviors anyway, to be virginal and holy and all those sorts of things. And we've already talked about that being a nun, or being a prioress especially, who's in charge of nuns, was one of the few places of power a woman could assume. So in this story, when we see the child given back a voice, it may be kind of this female dream in the Middle Ages of gaining a voice against evil forces, and those evil forces more abstractly may not just be the Jews, but could be men who would silence them. And that is an interesting part of the story. So there are a number of ways to consider the story. It's not just a simple miracle tale about a boy, and it's not just anti-Semitic. There is more going on with it than that. But it definitely has some darkness to it. And one of the big questions is, do we judge that this anti-Semitism is the Prioresses, and is it criticism of anti-Semitism? Because the Jews were kicked out of England in the 13th century, late 13th century. So, and that's before the Canterbury Tales are written. So Chaucer himself is writing in an England where the Jews have been kicked out, and there are largely negative associations with their culture. And so do we judge that to be Chaucer's attitude because it's the attitude of most of the people of his day, or do we judge him to be criticizing, as he does so many other things and practices, do we judge him to be criticizing the Prioresses' anti-Semitism as well? And I think that's a question that's very difficult to answer, and depending on what critics you read, depends on the answer you may come up with. And Chaucer himself was certainly well-traveled, but England was not the only country kicking the Jews out. In fact, Jews were often blamed for the Black Death, for poisoning whales and that sort of thing. And so it really just, there was generally a dark attitude towards them. They were considered moneylenders. Again, I refer back to Shakespeare, where there's a Jew playing a moneylender, and that was fairly common at the time. And that image, actually, the Jew as the moneylender, stays on today. I think there's a joke told by Jeff Dunham that I've heard, where he says something about if you throw a penny between two Jews, they'll fight to the death. And that's just an example of that stereotype of the Jews continuing even today in America, even after the Holocaust. And so, there's a long history of this sort of hate towards that group. But you can see them that they do live in a ghetto, and at the time, they were forced to live apart from regular society. And there were a number of attitudes towards the Jews at the time. They were blamed for the killing of Christ, but more than that, it was believed that Jews would convert when Christ came back, whenever that was, but that they wouldn't convert until that moment. And so what's the point right now of worrying about them too much until Christ comes back? They're just this evil group of people. And then there were some who were quite devoted to converting the Jews, believing that they were, after all the Jews were converted, Christ would come back. And so there were a number of positions on the Jews at the time, but a lot of them were negative. Anyway, so I just kind of want to point to these strains in the story and how important they are, and have you consider them this week. And again, I hope you enjoy this story, and we'll see you next week.